9 hikers went into the Ural Mountains. 9 hikers died. But there was a 10th person on that expedition, and nobody has ever explained why they turned back. By the end of this, you'll know who that 10th person was, what the Soviet government did to erase them from history, and the real reason 9 experienced hikers were found dead in the snow, with no explanation that has ever fully held up. February 1959. 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on a ski trek through one of the most remote mountain corridors in the Soviet Union. Their destination was Otorten, a peak whose name, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people, translates roughly to, "Don't go there." They were not amateurs. Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, had completed dozens of high-difficulty treks. The others were seasoned, fit, prepared. This was supposed to be a Category 3 hike, the highest difficulty rating in the Soviet classification system, but still, a hike. Not a death sentence. Their last confirmed contact with the outside world was a telegram sent from a small settlement called Vizhai on January 28. After that, silence. When they failed to return by the agreed date, a search party was dispatched. What they found at the slope of Kholat Syakhl, which translates, and this is not a coincidence, to a dead mountain, was something that has haunted investigators, researchers, and governments for over 60 years. The tent. Slashed open from the inside. Personal belongings left behind. Food untouched. And the hikers, scattered across the snow in various states that made absolutely no sense. Some had fled in sock feet. In -30 degrees Celsius. Some were found with catastrophic internal injuries, broken ribs, a crushed skull, but with no external wounds. No bruising. No cuts. As if they had been compressed by an enormous invisible force. Soviet authorities closed the investigation within months. Cause of death, an unknown compelling force. The files were classified. And here is where the story you've been told ends. But here's what they didn't tell you. The original expedition group was not 9 people. It was 10. Yuri Yudin. 21 years old. A student. A friend of Dyatlov's. He had trained for this trek the same as the others, packed the same equipment, and walked the same first 3 days of the journey out of Vizhai alongside his companions. And then, on January 28, the same day as that last telegram, Yudin turned back. The official reason given was illness. Joint pain. He said his knees were too swollen to continue. The group dropped him at the last settlement, and he watched them ski away into the mountains. He would never see any of them alive again. Now here is the detail that should stop you cold. Yudin lived until 2013. He spent the rest of his life publicly advocating for the investigation to be reopened. He gave interviews. He preserved evidence. He told reporters, more than once, that he believed the Soviet government knew exactly what happened on that mountain and had chosen to bury it. He said that before he left the group, certain equipment had gone missing from their supplies, equipment he could not account for, and that when he later tried to raise this discrepancy with investigators, he was told to stop asking questions. He was never formally silenced. He was never arrested. But every avenue he pursued was quietly closed. Documents he requested were denied. Officials stopped returning calls. The case file that was supposedly open to researchers in the 1990s was found to be incomplete. Specific pages, gone. Yudin died at age 75, and to his last breath he said he did not know the full truth. But he believed, with certainty, that his illness on January 28 had saved his life. The question is, how would he know that? What did he see before he turned back? You've probably heard the theories. Avalanche. Infrasound. A Soviet military weapons test. Katabatic wind. A Yeti, yes, that one still circulates. Each theory has passionate defenders. Each theory has a fatal flaw. The avalanche theory, endorsed by Russian investigators as recently as 2019, fails to explain why the tent was cut from the inside. An avalanche doesn't make you cut your way out, it buries you. And a slope analysis conducted by independent researchers found the incline at that location was too gentle to generate a lethal slide. The infrasound theory, that low-frequency sound waves caused mass panic, is genuinely interesting. Wind moving across the Siberian terrain can produce standing waves of sound below human hearing that induce anxiety, disorientation, even hallucinations. But infrasound doesn't break ribs. It doesn't crush a skull. The military weapons test theory is the one that keeps serious researchers up at night. Because here is what we know for certain, the region around Kholat Syakhl was an active Soviet military testing corridor in 1959. The Soviets were developing parachute mines, pressure-detonated ordnance that explodes above the ground and kills through concussive force with minimal external markings. The injury profile of several victims, massive internal damage, no surface wounds, matches parachute mine trauma almost exactly. And there is one more thing. Search party members reported seeing strange orange spheres of light in the sky over the pass in the days following the deaths. This was corroborated by independent witnesses in other settlements. The Soviet military, when pressed, said they had no explanation. Which is the kind of answer that is itself an answer. But here's what none of these theories address. None of them explain Yudin. None of them explain why a healthy young man with joint pain knew, with enough certainty to say so 50 years later, that leaving that mountain saved his life. Unless he saw something before he left. Something that made him afraid before there was anything to be afraid of. And before we get to what that something may have been, you need to understand one stranger, darker piece of this puzzle first. Among the personal cameras recovered from the tent, there were 4. 3 of them contained photographs that were developed and catalogued by investigators. The 4th camera was logged into evidence and then vanished from the record entirely. Not destroyed. Not classified. Vanished. As in, the evidence log shows it was received. The next entry shows it was gone. No transfer record. No destruction order. No name attached to its disappearance. That camera belonged to Yuri Yudin's closest friend on the expedition. And Yudin, when asked about it directly in a 2012 interview, paused for a very long time, and said he didn't want to talk about the cameras. Here is what the declassified portions of the file, the testimony of surviving search party members, and investigative journalism published between 2013 and 2020 allow us to reconstruct. On the morning of January 28, before Yudin turned back, the group made a stop at an abandoned geological storage facility, a structure used by Soviet survey teams operating in the region. This stop is mentioned in Dyatlov's personal diary and in Yudin's own trip log. Both accounts describe the group finding equipment left behind at the facility and taking some of it for the journey ahead. What neither account names specifically is what that equipment was. A Soviet geological survey team operating in that corridor in 1957, 2 years prior, had filed a report that was classified within 6 months of submission. That report described anomalous radiation readings in the mountain region around Kholat Syakhl. The survey team had recommended the area be flagged and avoided pending further investigation. That recommendation was never acted on. Now consider the autopsy findings that Soviet authorities initially tried to suppress. Several of the Dyatlov hikers showed signs of radioactive contamination. Their clothing tested positive for radioactive particles, specifically on the areas that would be exposed if they had handled contaminated equipment. Their skin showed discoloration consistent with low-level radiation sickness. This was not publicly disclosed at the time of the original investigation. It emerged only when files were partially released in the 1990s. The current working theory among serious researchers is this: the group unknowingly transported contaminated equipment from that storage facility into their camp. At some point during the night, possibly triggered by a physical reaction in the tent, they became aware something was wrong. They cut their way out in a panic. In the darkness and the cold, disoriented by early radiation effects or by a concussive event caused by whatever triggered the contamination, they scattered. Some fled toward the tree line. Some collapsed where they stood. The injuries consistent with parachute mine trauma may indicate a secondary detonation event, something stored at that facility that the group had unknowingly carried with them. Yudin, who turned back before the equipment was distributed for carrying, was the only one who never handled it. He didn't have joint pain. Or maybe he did. But what he also had, was doubt. A feeling. Something he saw in that storage facility that morning that he has never fully described on record. He saved his own life by listening to it. Why would the Soviet government cover this up? The answer is almost disappointingly straightforward. 1959 was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet military was conducting weapons tests, nuclear research, and classified geological surveys across the Ural region with no public disclosure and no safety infrastructure for civilian populations anywhere near those corridors. Acknowledging that 9 university students had died because of negligently stored contaminated military equipment, and that the warning signs had been available and ignored since 1957, would have been a catastrophic political and PR disaster. It was easier to call it an unknown compelling force. To classify the files. To let the mystery fester. A mystery is survivable. Accountability is not. Yudin was not silenced because he knew too much. He was tolerated precisely because he didn't know enough. He had suspicions. He had a feeling. He had a gap in the evidence log where a camera used to be. But he didn't have proof. And without proof, a Soviet-era grieving survivor is just noise. The tragedy of Yuri Yudin is not that he survived. It's that he spent 54 years trying to find out what he survived instead of, and knowing that the answer was somewhere in a filing cabinet in Moscow, waiting to outlive everyone who needed it buried. The Dyatlov Pass case was officially re-examined by Russian prosecutors between 2019 and 2020. Their conclusion: avalanche. Case closed. Researchers who had spent years compiling the radiation evidence, the weapons test correlations, the missing camera log, the classified 1957 geological survey, they called the 2020 ruling what it was. A second burial. 9 people died on a mountain called Dead Mountain, on a slope beneath a peak called Don't Go There, carrying equipment they should never have touched, in a testing corridor that should never have been open to civilians. And the one person who could have told us what he saw at that storage facility that January morning, took it with him. The files still exist. Portions remain classified. The 4th camera has never been recovered. And somewhere in the Russian Federal Archive system, there is a 1957 geological survey report that has never been made public. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it explains everything. But you now know more than most people ever will about what really happened at Dyatlov Pass, and more importantly, you know what someone worked very hard to make sure you never found out. If this broke something in you a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next time, we're going inside the Soviet sleep experiment. The classified file that was never supposed to leave the building. The one that, according to 3 separate sources, describes something that cannot be explained by any known science. You'll want to be here for that one.